Guys, welcome back for Objective 2, Solving Quadratic Equations by Factoring. So before we can get into actually doing that objective, we need to first talk about the zero product property. So watch this clip it's from Hidden Figures, the movie. Great movie to watch if you're looking for something to watch in quarantine. But this is just the first 40 seconds of the movie, talking about the zero product property. So go ahead and hop over there and watch that and then hop on back. So basically what we're going to be solving in there isn't quite as complicated, but the basic thing that we wanted you to take away is the zero product property. If two numbers multiply to equal 0, then at least one of those terms has to be 0. And it only works for 0 because 0 is the only thing. You can't multiply and get 0 any other way than to multiply by 0. So the first thing we're going to start with is finding x values that make a statement true. So looking at number 1, x minus 4 is equal to 0. So if I add over my 4, then x has to equal 4. Simple enough, right? If x plus 6 equals 0, we minus 6 over, and then x has to equal negative 6. Straightforward one-step equations, right? So 6 minus x equals 0. You're going to have to minus the 6 first, which then will give you negative x equals to negative 6. So you get rid of the negative on the x by making it a positive. So it would be x is equal to positive 6. Number 6, a little bit trickier. 2x plus 1 equals 0. So you just got to minus the 1 first. So you get 2x is equal to negative 1. Dividing by 2, you get x is equal to negative 1/2. So it's another two-stepper. So go ahead and work out the rest of these 4 equations and hop back over to check your work. For those answers to the other 4, make sure you've got them right. Email us if you have a question. All right, so looking at this next piece, all of these are actually factored for us, which makes it very easy. So we notice that we have a factor of x minus 2 times a factor of x plus 3. And those two things multiplied together equals 0. So that means by the zero product property, if they multiply to be 0, then one of these two has to be 0. They don't both have to be 0, just one of them has to be 0. So we're going to set each factor equal to 0 and then solve. So for the first one, we add 2. We get x is equal to 2. For the second one, we minus 3. So we get x is equal to negative 3. So we have two answers. X is equal to 2 and x is equal to negative 3. You could also write that as x is equal to 2 comma negative 3 in a curly bracket or without the curly bracket, or just write negative 2 or negative 3 and 2, whichever way you want to write it. Do not, however, write it in parentheses 2 comma negative 3, because then it looks like an ordered pair, x, 2, y, negative 3, and that's not what it is. So do make sure you use curly braces or just an and sign or x equals, whichever way, but do not use parentheses. It's also important to check your work. So let's look at what happens when we check this. So if we check first the 2, we're going to do 2 minus 2 times 2 plus 3, and that equals 0. So 2 minus 2 is in fact 0, times 2 plus 3 is 5, which does in fact give us 0, so we know that that worked. Do make sure that you're checking one x at a time. You're not going to plug both x's in, you're just plugging one in at a time. Then we're going to do negative 3 minus 2 times negative 3 plus 3, and see if that equals 0. So negative 3 minus 2 is negative 5, and negative 3 plus 3 is 0, and that is 0. So we know that negative 3 worked. You do want to make sure that you check them separately and that you plug in to both x's with the same number. Looking at example 2, we have these two factors. So we're going to set them both equal to 0. I'm going to move this up here. So setting that first one equal to 0, we have 3x minus 2 equals 0 and x plus 6 equals 0. Adding the 2 over, we get 3x is equal to 2, so x has to equal 2/3. And then setting this one equal to 0, minus 6, so x has to equal -6. So writing it in that way. When you look down to number 3, we have this 3x factor out front, and then an x minus 8. So we're taking x minus 8 and we're multiplying it by 3x. 3x can indeed be 0, and so we can set that equal to 0. So we'll have 3x is equal to 0, and x minus 8 is equal to 0. So x is equal to 0, and x is equal to 8. Looking at number 4, we do have a number out front, but that 2 can't be 0. 2 is 2. It's always 2. There's no variance to it. In number 3, it was 3x, so that x varies the value outside. But since 2 is just by itself, it will always be 2, and therefore not 0, which would make the whole thing go away. So the 2 we just kind of ignore. We don't need it. But we are going to pay attention to the 2 other factors. So we'll have x plus 4 equals to 0, x minus 1 equals 0. Subtracting the 4, x equals -4, and x, adding the 1, x equals 1. So x is equal to -4, and x is equal to 1. When it's factored, it's very easy. Go ahead, take a couple minutes and find your x values for the rest of these 6 problems, and then check back with for your answers. All right, going ahead, checking your work before we move on, making sure you've got them all correct. Again, remember the 2 and the 5 are always just 2 or just 5 and can't be 0, so you ignore them when you find your answer. But 2x, since it has an x attached to it, can be 0, so you want to make sure you set it equal to 0 as well. So, did you notice any patterns when you were looking through those? What you should have noticed is that the sign of the number in the parentheses is always the opposite of the sign in the answer. And that should remind you back to when we did things with x-intercepts in the last, I think it was the first week of remote learning. For each equation, you should be getting 2 answers because there were 2 factors that equal to 0. You'll find that quadratic equations, a lot of the time, you will get 2 answers. Sometimes there's only 1, and sometimes there are none, but in here, most of the time, we will have 2. And then when you find points on the graph and you get y is equal to 0, remember that's your x-intercepts. So really what we're finding here are our x-intercepts, if you wanted to think about it that way. All right, so now in your next video, we'll actually start factoring in order to solve these quadratic equations.